Okay, I'm very excited to have on the Goldstein on Gelt show Professor Nancy K. Schlossberg, who has written, 10 books or so related to retirement and aging. And her newest book, called Too Young to Be Old, is about transitions, and it was highlighted recently in Money Magazine. Nancy, real pleasure to have you on.
I'm delighted to be on.
So you talk in your book about many things, and I want to focus today on retirement. Really, I want to focus on the transition to retirement. What are some of the things that people who are getting close to retirement need to worry about or plan in order to have a successful retirement?
Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me just give you an incident. I was interviewing a CFO of a Fortune 100 company, and he said very dramatically, "Retirement is hollow." Then he hit the table with his fist. He said, "This is solid. Retirement isn't." Now, here was a man whose pension was $1 million, let alone other things. And yet to him, retirement was hollow. He had not even thought about retirement. He had thought, well, I've got enough money to retire. The organization has still an office for me. I can still use their secretary. So retirement's nothing to think about in advance, except he realized after the fact he should have thought about it.
Wow. So what did it feel like? Let's go to the bad side. What did he mean by it's hollow?
Well, I asked him, I said, what does that mean? Well, he was used to having a lot of influence, a lot of power, an established place in the world. And although he still had a lot of money, his identity was changing. His psychological portfolio was in flux. See, I talk a lot about that. You talk about probably financial portfolios, and I talk about your psychological portfolio, and that's the thing you need to be aware of before and during your retirement.
All right, so let's follow this metaphor that you're describing. When I design a portfolio for someone, one of the most critical factors that I look into is the asset allocation model. And it's really what percentage of the portfolio can be risky and what percentage has to be safer. How does that play out in the concept of a psychological portfolio when someone is planning for a mentally secure retirement?
Well, what are the three things that are the most important? One is your identity, who you are. When I was a professor working, it was very simple. I could say, I'm a professor. Then when you retire, how do you identify yourself? Who are you? You were a professor, but that's the past. So the identity is very critical. Who are you? Who are you becoming? And that is very tied to the second part, a major part of your portfolio, purpose. When you worked, whether you are a roofer or a banker or an artist or a reporter, in addition to your identity, you had a reason to get up in the morning. You had someplace to go. You had something to do. You had a purpose. Sometimes you didn't like your purpose, but you had a purpose. I have found that people, when they have no purpose and they're floundering, can get very depressed. So the identity and the purpose are related to each other. I'll give you an example. A reporter from a major newspaper in the United States was the happiest person I ever met when he retired, because the day he retired, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. He had set up his garage as an art studio, and he was becoming a serious painter. He was not willing to call himself a painter until he had an art show, which he did a year later. But he knew exactly what he wanted to do. So he had a purpose, he had an identity. However, most people aren't quite as clear. They're sort of floundering. I certainly was floundering when a reporter called me about a project I had been working on at Maryland about 2 weeks after I retired. And he said, "How should I identify you?" I didn't know what to say. I could not get the words out of my mouth. I'm retired. So,
oh my goodness. Yeah, well, I'll identify. We're talking with Professor Nancy K. Schlossberg, who Well, we'll talk about whether she really is retired, but has just recently come out with a new book called Too Young to Be Old. Now, Nancy, you started by telling us, you said there were 3 important things, and you listed 2. You said when you retire, you have to figure out who you are. What's your identity? Right. And then you said you got to figure out what your purpose is. That's number 2. So tell me, what's number 3?
Number 3 is that your relationships are in a jumble sometimes. For example, your work relationships. Now, I still have a few close friends from the University of Maryland, but in general, I don't see the people anymore that I interacted with every day, that I had coffee with, that I shared, that I was on committees with. I don't see them. So that changed. Your whole network changes. Now let's take family. One woman said to me, now that I'm retired, what do I do? My daughter expects me to fly up to Wisconsin and babysit so we can go on vacation. But she doesn't just do it once a year. She wants to do it 2 or 3 times a year. Do I have to do that? I don't want to do that, but I feel guilty all the time.
Oh, no.
So what happens when you're retired? People expect different things of you.
So let's talk about, I want to dive into this expectation and as it relates to kids, because one of the things that I see in my day job as a financial advisor is that a lot of times people who are retired and they have grown-up kids, and the grown-up kids maybe are not as financially secure, and they kind of expect some financial help from their retired parents. And it gets to be difficult. You're saying about your list number 3 was figuring out your relationships. And it can be very tense because you feel, well, listen, I do have a lot of money because I've been saving for my whole life, but I don't feel comfortable enough to share that with the next generation yet. Can't they just wait? How should people deal with that?
Well, that's very interesting, the whole money thing. I think one way, if you have money, if the older generation has money, one of the good ways to transfer money is paying for kids' education, for your grandchildren's education, for their after-school activities. So there are many ways that you can do it, but there is the expectation that the grandparents or the parents will help. And clearly that's there. Now, what do you do about it? You have to set boundaries, and you have to have what I call an expectation exchange. What do you expect us to do? What do you need? And get it clarified.
Is that a conversation? I mean, this expectation exchange?
Yeah, it's a conversation. In my own instance, there have been times when I've gifted my kids money, when I've paid for my grandkids parts of their education. And there are other times when I don't. My son is an entrepreneur, a serial entrepreneur, and when he's doing very well, I don't need to do that. So it depends how you feel about money, how they feel about money, but it's all about relationship. How open are you with your adult children?
I think it's about the communication that you have with them. In other words, but that ability to communicate with your adult children is something that people really have to begin working on when they're much, much younger, because it must be very difficult if you haven't communicated about money with people. And I've certainly seen a lot of older people, they're not used to sharing their money.
Right.
They're not used to discussing it with people, and all of a sudden you say, now you got to talk to your kids about it, and they don't even have a common vocabulary.
Well, and then to complicate the relationship part of the portfolio, let's suppose you're married, or you live in a partnership, or you live with somebody. Now, this was very funny because I was giving a speech at Georgia State right after I retired. My husband was doing a consultation at Georgia State, so he was there. We were there together. So he came over to hear my speech. During the Q&A, somebody said, well, how is it now that you've retired? I said, well, it's horrible. And I burst out laughing. I said, my husband is in the front row. And I said, what really startled me, totally unexpected, I have always worked. And then suddenly I'm retired. And my husband says, when are you leaving? When are you coming back? When will I see you again? And it was like I had a supervisor. And I didn't know how to deal with it. So we dealt with it with humor. But it took me a while to get used to another person to whom I had to report. I eventually shifted it and didn't see it as I have to report, but I want to report. I want to know where he is.
It's a relationship. You're together. You want to have someone to talk to. It reminds me of I had a quite elderly couple in my office once, and they were very, very wealthy, and the husband was still working. I said, you don't actually have to continue working. You've got plenty of money to, for the rest of your life. And his wife, she slammed her hand on the table and she said, Doug, I married him for better or for worse, but not for lunch.
Exactly.
And she wanted him out of the house. Well, but it's true. I think people really have to find, it's not just the money, which is just one aspect of it. It's the relationships as well. Nancy, I'm very, very much enjoying the conversation, but unfortunately we are just about out of time. But I do know that you have written about this extensively and you teach about this. In the last few seconds, just tell me, how can people follow you and follow your work? Well,
I have a website, www, and then one word, transitionsthrough, THROUGH, life.com. And my books are listed, different speeches I've given, and they can find me that way. Actually, I don't mind people emailing me, nancyks4@gmail.com. And I'm on Facebook, but I'm just getting used to being on Facebook and Twitter. So the best way is email or website. And I have really enjoyed this, and I appreciate your interviewing me, Doug. I didn't know about you and your program, so this is very nice.
And now you can be an avid listener, and you can get on Twitter and tweet about it as well. Nancy, we will put links to all of what you just told us about at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. Nancy K. Schlossberg, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Doug.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Check out all of Doug's money ideas at goldsteinongelt.com. Doug specializes in helping people who live outside the United States handle their U.S. investment accounts. If you have a question that you would like answered on the air or off, contact Doug at his website or send him an email to doug@profile-financial.com.